One of the biggest problems with the communist mindset is that communism always wants to find simple answers. Any problem that exists requires a simple, easy to digest answer. The problem, of course, when it comes to economics is that answers are never simple. In fact, if you find a simple answer to an economic problem, the chances are you're wrong and that the answer is actually going to lead to much worse outcomes than what you initially thought. Now, there are simple terms in economics that is widely understood and makes sense. For example, if you want prices to come down, you have to increase the supply of a product way beyond what is the demand for the product. So supply and demand increases or decreases price. This is a simple concept. The reality, however, is if you wish to influence either one of these, either supply or demand, then it becomes a hell of a lot more complex. Now, in our story today, we are, of course, looking towards Peter Krill once again, because, of course, we will be talking about this guy from time to time. I know some of you don't like talking about him. The fact is, most of you think that he's irrelevant and he's only seeking, seeking validation and seeking sort of attention. The fact is, he does have influence. There are thousands of people that listen to what he has to say and believe him. And that's because easy answers tend to find a lot of resonance with ordinary people. This is why when I make my economic videos, I try to condense it in the most simplistic term possible, even though it's never simplistic, and why most of you don't watch my economic videos, because there's a lot of stuff, right? There's a lot of data. It's the thing that I love about economics. It's just how deep you can actually go with something. I'll give you guys a great example of this. In New York City in 1948, they introduced a thing called rent control. And the idea was, since housing was becoming unaffordable in the wake of the Second World War, they wanted to cap the price of rent on certain properties to ensure that people could actually afford homes. The idea was that people who have money can rent the apartments that aren't rent controlled, and people who don't can rent the rent controlled apartments. We now have so many studies. If you actually just look at this study and you go to this chart, look at the amount of studies that's been done on controlled rents and the influence that controlled rent has had. The thinking was sort of simple and it kind of made sense, except it had the complete opposite effect, where apartment blocks where rent control was instituted actually led to the rent of the other apartments skyrocketing to the point where almost no one could afford to live in them except for very, very rich people. And this kind of makes sense when you think about it. A landlord that has 20 apartments that charges, let's say, 100 Rand per apartment per month, suddenly the state tells them you can only charge 50 Rand for half of your apartments. Now, suddenly, from 2,000 Rand a month, they're going down to 1,500 Rand a month. What will they do? They'll increase the price on the 10 units that isn't rent controlled in order to get back up to 2,000 Rand for the building as a whole. So rent control actually did the opposite of what they thought was going to happen. And this is sort of the problem with communist thinking. They grab onto whatever kind of makes sense, and then they just run with it. So I'll play you the video from Peter Krill here, and then I'll quickly show you why Peter Krill should probably take some time off and just go do a little bit of economic studies just to get a grasp of what really influences things.
Cape Town is under an occupation, but not with tanks and guns, rather with property deeds and foreign bank transfers. This is the invincible occupation.
I think what he means to say is invisible occupation, right? Because you'll see as he explains everything in this video, he's making the argument that you can't see it, but it is happening. Invincible, Peter Krill, means can't be defeated. Right? So if you shot a bullet at it, nothing would happen. That's invincible. Invisible is you can't see it.
In 2025 alone, foreign nationals dropped over 1 billion Rand on Cape Town real estate, making up close to 40% of sales in prime hotspots like the Atlantic Seaboard, Constantia, City Bowl, and even Boerkaap, where culture is being thrown out and turned into a postcard.
See, but this is also just completely wrong. Culture isn't thrown out and turned into a postcard. The culture exists and people enjoy the culture. If anything, if you were to actually speak to the people in those cultural areas, they will tell you they benefit from the tourism. They benefit from the foreigners who come there, who spend their money buying cultural goods, taking part in cultural food ceremonies and all the rest of it. So it's not, how is it being replaced? He doesn't. Of course, this is the other problem with communism. They never actually go into detail about what they mean. They just make these wild claims and then go, "Oh, yeah, this is clearly happening."
South Africans who build immense wealth eventually sell out, and who can pay 20 million rand cash. Not your neighbor, not your worker, but the Brit, the German, and the Swiss investor. Cape Town is not a city anymore. It's a monopoly board where locals don't get to roll the dice. Communities are stripped, culture becomes a decoration.
All right, the rest of it is just him basically speaking out of his behind. Well, the whole of the video is him speaking out of his behind, but this is just, he just continues speaking out of his behind. So let's just quickly go. He mentions Boerkaap, the Atlantic seaboard, the rich areas of the city. And those areas make up a very small part of the city, just FYI. So fundamentally, even if rich people are only buying up 40% of that land, 60% is still owned by South Africans. And more importantly, when you actually go and you do the research, and yes, I fact checked all of these results, you find that the total value, remember, he said 1 billion rand was spent by foreigners. Again, a weird statistic, because in all of the research I found, that's a guesstimate at best. But he said 1 billion rand. The total value of property sold in Cape Town alone was 82.3 billion rand. So investors, foreign investors, made up 1 billion of 83.3 billion rand. In other words, foreign investors made up almost none, right? That's a very low amount. 1%. Less than 1% actually went to foreign investors. But his argument is that there's an invincible occupation that is happening and that this is pushing ordinary South Africans out of the property market, which is literally not true. First and foremost, as you can see from these numbers, most of these people are still normal people buying normal homes. And more importantly, people will not be able to purchase. Most ordinary people cannot buy homes in places like the Atlantic seaboard. These are rich areas. Even if you go to the most socialist countries in the world, the Scandinavian countries, their cities like Oslo, for example, in Norway, have rich areas where most ordinary people can't afford to buy. That's just the nature of life, right? There's going to be people. And by the way, if you were ever to become rich, you too would want to live in those areas. So you only hate it, or most people only hate it because they can't afford it. I happen to not even want to live there in the first place. But never mind that. So that's his first claim, right? Completely irrelevant. It's less than 1% of the total property value sold in Cape Town in general. But the point that he's trying to make here is that property value, and the property value in Cape Town is insane, by the way. The housing in Cape Town has become incredibly expensive. In fact, in almost all areas in South Africa, Cape Town is the one area where property value continues to go up, and a lot of people are priced out of the market. But this is where that communist thinking comes in, that inability to think past the very simplistic answers that you're seeking to find. Because when you actually start to dive into it, you realize that there are currently around 14,000 homeless people living in Cape Town. If you go by people living in informal settlements, so not yet housing, that's 20.5%, or about 1 million people in Cape Town living in informal settlements. So people who can't afford to buy a home. These people, the homeless and the informal settlement people, they were never going to own a home in the Atlantic seaboard, even with the 1 billion rand spent by foreigners of the total 83 billion rand spent by all people in Cape Town. Why will these people never be able to afford a home? Well, first, the economy isn't growing, the ANC isn't creating jobs, but more importantly, why is housing prices in Cape Town so incredibly expensive? Well, that's because there's not enough homes. You see, Cape Town is currently receiving over 100,000 new people semigrating from other parts of South Africa to Cape Town every single year. 120,000. In the Western Cape, it's even worse. There's even more people coming in the whole of the Western Cape. The current rate of house building in the Western Cape, so properties actually being built, is between 8,000 and 10,000 homes built every single year. So you already start to see the problem here. There is massive demand for homes, but the supply isn't able to keep up with the demand. So why is this so low? You would think that if property developers know that there are millions of people in the city looking for homes, and there are hundreds of thousands of people coming every single year looking for a home, the developers should be jumping out of their skin, building property for all of these people to live in. So what's taking so long? Well, for this, I went to Grok and I asked Grok to tell me how long does it normally take for a property to go from the idea to the actual completion of the project. And here it comes to between 4 and 5 years from idea all the way to completion, and oftentimes way longer than that due to the insane amounts of regulation that you have to jump through. Just look at that, right? So you have the market research and stuff, that's sort of normal. Then site acquisition between 1 and 6 months, town planning and land use approvals. This is all government stuff, 6 to 12 months to 24 months. Building plan approval and documentation, 2 to 8 weeks, or up to 3 to 6 months. The extreme is 12 to 24 months. Pre-construction, 1 to 3 months. Construction, 6 to 12 months. So you can see if we could cut down on the things that actually takes the most time, this year is actually not that bad. We could do an entire property within less than a year if this didn't take so bloody long to actually get done. I then asked it how much of this is due to national government and how much of it is due to the Western Cape. And while it did argue, and yes, I did again fact check all of this. So while it did tell me that it's difficult to calculate, roughly 70% of all of the laws and bylaws and regulations for building property comes from national government and the national government's regulations around how this can be done. So that's the problem. So when you look at Peter Krill and he makes all of these wild claims about foreign investors and their invincible occupation of the west of Cape Town, it makes no sense when you actually look at the data. But then again, the communist mindset doesn't care about the data. It cares about a quick and easy answer. Here's the problem. Here's the answer. It's quick, easy. Everyone can understand it. Share this video around with as many people as you can. Next time you hear someone talk out of their bottom about, oh, housing prices are so bad because of foreigners living in our city. Foreigners make up less than 1% of all the property bought in Cape Town. They do not affect the price of property. Not really. They'll have an effect on the rich areas, but that does not account for the prices in non-rich areas where foreigners aren't buying. That is purely down to market supply and demand. There's too much demand and not enough supply. And until we can relax the regulations to get people to build properties faster, this isn't going to change. Not to even mention how long it takes to get an informal settlement off the ground, because that takes between 5 and 10 years for the government to actually build low affordable housing because of government regulations once again. So yeah, the communist mindset is just insane. I wanted to share this with you because I find it truly fascinating. If you found it fascinating and you think more people should see what I have to offer, please consider hitting that like button, hitting that subscribe button, and smashing the bell. Also leaving a comment because it truly does help. Then massive shout out and thank you to all of the patrons and the YouTube channel members. To become a patron or a YouTube channel member, just hit the link in the description down below. You'll get to see videos like this one way before anyone else. As always, be good to each other, be kind to each other, and I'll see all of you in the next one. Peace.